We've just come through a by-election in Eden Monaro. In fact, it's very much an election year. By way of interest, I mentioned this to Michael, the Russian constitutional referendum has just ended. And don't say Putin's not smart. There were a whole heap of proposals in the referendum, one of which was to cement Putin in office. Under the Constitution there, presidents are banned from serving more than 2 consecutive terms. The referendum asked the voters whether they would extend the incumbent Putin's term for a further 12 years after his current term expires in 2024. He did serve 2 terms as president until 2008. The 2-term limit kicked in, and he then spent 4 years in the less influential position of Prime Minister. He returned to the presidency in 2012, was re-elected in 2018, and now the constitutional referendum, the 67-year-old Putin will have complete control, which he has, of the parliament. He's got control of the media. And what he did through the media, it's interesting this, he promoted a yes vote, but they gave little publicity to the important vote to extend Putin until 2036. After allegations of intimidation and fraud, 78% voted in favour of the changes. The Central Election Commission, actually, you'll love this, announced that the yes vote had prevailed before some polling stations had closed. This is Russia. Sounds like a few things here, doesn't it? But it was symbolic anyway because Parliament had approved the changes in March and Putin had already signed them into law. But make no mistake, his popularity has nosedived. 35% of Russians, those prepared to speak out, as of June, disapproved of his performance. But all that's for another day. Putin prevailed by wrapping up his term limit in more than 200 other constitutional changes, and voters were only committed to approve or reject the package as a whole. There you are. That's the way to do it. Now, as I said, elections everywhere. Singapore, Poland and Syria this month, a presidential election in America on November 3, and a Queensland state election in October, 117 days away. All of these issues we will cover. My next guest is one of the few people, as I said, in the Western world who became the leader of his party before entering the parliament. He'll be joining us each week to look at these elections, of course, but a lot of other issues. We want you who watch this program to hear from people who know what they're talking about. We won't be wasting your time. The former Premier of Campbell Newman is here and he joins me from Brisbane. Campbell, good evening to you. Thank you for your time.
G'day, Alan. It's just tremendous to be with you this evening. Thanks for having me on your show.
Well, not at all. Look, I've got to say we've raised a few eyebrows here because Campbell and I have had a few brushes in the past, but we have been mates for a long, long time. But before we go on to anything, we should just say this, Campbell, it's a special day today, 80 years old, the Story Bridge. And people would understand that the consulting engineer for the Story Bridge was the one, John Bradfield. We've got these lovely pictures and it was the same as the Sydney Harbour Bridge. And they were to link up, which they did. And the first car went over the Story Bridge 80 years ago. They're going to have a fairly special celebration, Campbell, I understand.
They are indeed. And it's also interesting to note, Alan, that as I recall, they did use some bits and pieces, cables and things like that from the Sydney Harbour Bridge on bridge projects in Brisbane, I think, including the Story Bridge.
Yeah, I do.
But it's also, by the way, my 29th wedding anniversary today as well. So Mrs Newman, who's watching, is probably more interesed in that. But I'm joining you and the viewers this evening.
Well, Mrs Newman, I'll send you something special tomorrow. Thank you for lending us your husband tonight. One other point to make here, Campbell, which is an interesting slice of history, and you would know this, but just for our viewers, there is a smaller Story Bridge at Salisbury in Brisbane, and it was built by all women engineers, basically as a practical demonstration of what could be done.
That's right.
And at Salisbury was the place...
Construction Training Centre. Yeah.
Training Centre, yep. And Salisbury was the place where the original steel for the Story Bridge was processed by Evans Deacon. So that's all a little bit of history. Now, Campbell, one thing I thought we'd have a look at tonight, which people don't understand about this man, but I knew his mum and dad. They were very significant figures in Australian politics. Your dad, Kevin Newman, was a very distinguished servant in the military, resigned to contest the by-election in the seat of Bass in 1975, which basically represented the end of the Whitlam government. And Kevin Newman won that by-election with a swing of 17%, and it was all over. Now, you're a little boy. What do you remember of that?
Well, I remember a few things, Alan. I mean, I remember the excitement of 1975, and it was a turning point in Australian politics, and we saw the dismissal in November 75. So I certainly remember that, the excitement, the attention on northern Tasmania, where you had people like Malcolm Fraser and all the political bigwigs of that day, and Gough Whitlam descending on this, regional city. So it was pretty big. But I also remember an important point. You see, my parents up till the 70s were probably, conservatives, but they were also swing voters as well. And I remember in 72, as a child, my first political experience, Gough Whitlam was literally our local member in the western suburbs of Sydney, when Dad was there as an army officer. And I know that my mum and dad actually voted for Gough. But by 1975, so only 3 years later, they realised he was a disaster. They became committed members of the Liberal Party, and they spent their I suppose, the next 30 years sort of being opposed to the Labor Party.
Yeah,
so there you go. That's a true story.
Well, it's a good story. Now, your dad, yes, well, I knew your dad very, very well, Kevin, a lovely man and a wonderful servant of the Australian people, and was an outstanding minister in the Fraser government. But he left Parliament in 1984. And am I right in saying that at the end of it all, he was the director of the Stockman's Hall of Fame?
Well, he was a director of it, yes. He was the Tasmanian representative, and that was one of those things he really enjoyed. Another thing he did post-politics was chairing the very large Launceston General Hospital in the north of the state, which I think sort of almost drove him to an early grave, I've got to say. I wouldn't recommend chairing a health board to anyone.
No, not at all. And then what people don't understand about Campbell's mum, a wonderful woman. In fact, I'm not gilding the lily here. There were many people who believed that Jocelyn Newman, had she been in the lower house, could have become our first female Prime Minister. She was outstanding. She entered the Parliament, Campbell's mum, Jocelyn, in 1986. And I might just share, because in her maiden speech, she quoted Dame Enid Lyons' first speech in the House of Representatives way back in 1943. And Jocelyn Newman said, "I know so well that fear, want and idleness can kill the spirit of any people. But I know too that security can be bought at too great a cost, the cost of spiritual freedom." She was a very, very powerful woman in her own way, very strong ideas, Campbell.
She was indeed, Alan. She was an intellect. She had a commanding personality. She was charming, and she managed to get people to do what she wanted throughout her career in the nicest possible way. So she was a natural leader. She was also personally, not overtly and outwardly, but she was personally deeply religious.
Yes,
and my sister and I know that from going through her personal effects. I'll say one thing too, Alan, you'll probably enjoy this. She wouldn't put up with the baloney that we hear from some female politicians today who sort of talk about misogyny or, sexism and things like that, not being listened to, like some of the Liberals have got on this sort of bandwagon. She would be heard because she made it her business to be heard in the cabinet room. Right. And there were times where she felt the blokes weren't listening, or she made damn well sure they did listen.
Absolutely.
And that's a matter of the record.
Well, another matter of the record is Jocelyn Newman fought 2 bouts of cancer while still serving in the ministry. Well, Campbell, I just thought we'd move from there to this whole Tasmanian scene. I mean, you're a former Lord Mayor of Brisbane. I often talk about this business of political overrepresentation. Tasmania has a population, and we're not reflecting adversely on Tasmania, but of 500,000. They have 12 senators. They have 5 members of the House of Representatives. They've got, in the lower house of the state parliament, 25 members. In the upper house, they've got 15 members. And then they've got about 160 councillors as well. Population, 500,000. You ran a city hall of about 1.2 million people. And how many councillors did you have?
Well, there was 26 councillors plus myself as number 27, running a budget of about $3 billion a year in those days. So, that was, I suppose, the other extreme. And the Brisbane City Council, by the way, works extremely well since it was set up in the 1920s.
Are we overgoverned, Campbell?
Well, we are. With the numbers you just gave, we should be deliriously happy with the political representation that we're getting, Alan. But I'll tell you an interesting thing. It's when, state governments look at local government reform, for example, and try and reduce the number of local governments, there tends to be significant community backlash. And I'll say this, that local government is actually strongly regarded or strongly supported by the community. So there's an issue there. The other thing you might be interested in is that when I was Premier, I literally was running a process for planning the future of Queensland. And as Premier, I actually felt it my duty and to put on the table that perhaps the first thing we should think about is getting rid of the state government.
Yes, very good.
You know what? Only one person out of 400 at a conference in Mackay, as I recall, supported me.
Yeah.
Maybe they felt sorry for me putting that up. But if we want change, we've got to speak up and do so in a meaningful way, because we do probably have great opportunities for reform.
Campbell, just before we go, because we'll be meeting with you every week, although I know next week Campbell's got a little bit of surgery of his own, so he won't be with us next week, but we will be after that. But just before you go, we talked about coal before. You've got this Boston-based insurance outfit, Liberty Mutual, who are on the public record as saying we'll have nothing to do with fossil fuels. And yet here they are with a subsidiary in Queensland seeking to expand their coal interests. I mean, do they think we're stupid?
Well, Alan, as you know, I am a strong supporter of the coal industry, but I'm not a supporter of blatant corporate hypocrisy. And on the one hand, these jokers are saying they won't support major projects like, for example, the Adani mine and other coal projects. But then, meantime, they've got an investment at Baralaba in central Queensland, not far from the town of Mara or west of Biloela. And so this is the nonsense that's been played out globally, Alan. Top corporates saying one thing, doing another, trying to pull the wool over our eyes. They need to be upfront about what they're doing. And there'll be a need for coal for some time to come. I'm confident of that.
Absolutely. But this is Campbell's making the point, just repeat it. This mob, the principal, head company, have distanced themselves from fossil fuels. They've pledged no direct investment in the coal industry at all. And a subsidiary of theirs, Mount Ramsay Coal, want the Queensland government to say, oh, please give us the go-ahead for further expansion. Campbell, we'll leave it there. Good to talk to you. Keep well. Happy anniversary.
Nice to be with you, Alan.
Happy anniversary. Love to the wife.
Mate.
And good luck next week, and we'll see you in a fortnight.